On November 21st, 1900, 5 men in brand-new suits walked up a staircase at 705 and a half Main Street in Fort Worth, Texas, and sat for a photograph. They were polite. They paid in cash. The photographer, John Swartz, arranged them carefully, 2 seated in front, 3 standing behind, and made a portrait so crisp that every buttonhole, every watch chain, every part in every oiled head of hair was visible. It was, by any technical measure, an excellent photograph. It was also the stupidest thing Butch Cassidy ever did. The 5 men were members of the Wild Bunch, the most wanted gang of bank and train robbers in the American West. Robert Leroy Parker, Butch Cassidy, sat at the right in the front row. Harry Longabaugh, the Sundance Kid, sat at the left. Between and behind them stood Harvey Logan, Will Carver, and Ben Kilpatrick, men with prices on their heads in half a dozen states. They had come to Fort Worth to spend stolen money in the saloons and bordellos of Hell's Half Acre, and somewhere between the whiskey and the women, somebody suggested they try out this new photography thing. Swartz displayed a copy in his studio window on Main Street, because of course he did. It was good work. A Fort Worth police detective named Charles Scott, whose job included escorting criminals to Swartz's studio for mug shots, spotted it and recognized Harvey Logan from wanted circulars. Within weeks, the Pinkerton National Detective Agency had copies on wanted posters circulating across the West. A Pinkerton agent would later call it the bad luck picture. Within 2 years, Carver was dead, Logan was dead, Kilpatrick was in prison, and Cassidy and the Sundance Kid had fled to South America, where they would die in a shootout in Bolivia. 5 men had walked up a staircase in Fort Worth and walked back down into the end of their lives. But here is the part of the story that matters. They felt safe in Fort Worth. That is the point. Hell's Half Acre was the kind of place where 5 of the most wanted men in America could walk down Main Street in daylight, sit for a formal portrait at a photography studio, and collect their prints a week later, without anyone turning them in, because turning in paying customers was bad for business, and in Fort Worth, business came first, always. That calculation, wickedness as an economic strategy, tolerated because it paid, is the engine that built this city and the fuse that eventually blew it apart. Fort Worth nearly didn't exist at all. It started as a military outpost, established in 1849 by Major Ripley Arnold on a bluff above the Trinity River to protect settlers from Comanche raids. It was named for General William Jenkins Worth, a Mexican-American war hero who, in one of history's small ironies, never set foot in Texas and is buried in Manhattan, underneath the Flatiron Building, whose Fort Worth namesake would one day carry panther gargoyles on its facade in his honor. The Army abandoned the post after just 4 years. A few stubborn families stayed. The town incorporated, grew to perhaps 4,000 people by 1873, and had a stone courthouse on the bluff. But the Civil War and Reconstruction nearly wiped it off the map. The population dropped to as few as 175 souls. By 1872, things were stirring again. William Boaz and Jacob Samuels opened general stores. Kleber Van Zandt established the bank that would become the Fort Worth National Bank. But the town was still fragile. Then came the cattle. After the war, millions of Faro longhorns roamed the Texas prairie, and demand for beef in the north was insatiable. The great Chisholm Trail cattle drives began moving herds north from San Antonio toward the railheads in Kansas, and Fort Worth sat directly on the route, the last place a drover could stop for supplies and rest before crossing the Red River into Indian Territory. Between 1866 and 1890, more than 4 million head of cattle passed through. At peak season, as many as 80,000 head could be grazing the open range just north of town. The cowboys who drove them did not come to Fort Worth for the scenery. They came because after weeks in the saddle, they wanted a bath, a drink, a card game, and a woman, roughly in that order. And Fort Worth was happy to provide all 4. The businesses that sprang up to service the cattle trade, saloons, dance halls, gambling parlors, bordellos, clustered along the lower end of Rusk Street, south of the courthouse, toward the railroad depot. They would eventually spread across 4 north-south thoroughfares, Main, Rusk, Calhoun, and Jones, from 7th Street down to 15th. The district was designated as one of the city's 3 political wards in 1876, but nobody called it the 3rd Ward. They called it Hell's Half Acre, or just the Acre. By 1881, the Fort Worth Democrat was complaining that it covered 2.5 acres. It would keep growing. But before the Acre could thrive, the city almost died. The Panic of 1873 devastated the frontier economy. The Texas and Pacific Railway, which had been laying track westward toward Fort Worth, ran out of money and stopped construction 30 miles short of town. Businesses shuttered. The population drained away. And then, in 1875, a Dallas lawyer named Robert Cowart wrote an article for the Dallas Herald claiming that Fort Worth was so deserted he had seen a panther asleep in the middle of Main Street, unbothered by any human activity. It was meant as an insult, Dallas mocking its western neighbor as a dying town where wild animals napped in the road. Fort Worth took the insult and swallowed it whole. The editor of the Fort Worth Democrat, B.B. Paddock, turned the panther into a mascot, a symbol not of sleepiness, but of ferocity waiting to be unleashed. Citizens raised money, picked up the abandoned tools and materials the railroad workers had left behind, and with what one historian called Herculean effort, completed the tracks themselves. On July 19, 1876, the first Texas and Pacific Railway locomotives steamed into Fort Worth. The city threw a celebration that is still commemorated. The population jumped to 6,663 by 1880. The panther, meant to kill them, became their emblem. They put one on the police badges. They would put stone panthers on their buildings. Panther City stuck. The railroad changed everything, because now Fort Worth was not just a rest stop, it was a shipping point. Cattle could be loaded onto rail cars and sent north to Kansas City or Chicago. The city's first streetcar line began running in December 1876, traveling from the courthouse down Main Street to the T&P Depot, connecting with beautiful efficiency the seat of law to the center of commerce to the gateway out of town. Money poured in, and the first thing money did was pour itself into the Acre. Within 15 city blocks, according to one account, there were 20 saloons, even more brothels, and an assortment of dance halls, gambling houses, opium dens, and cockfight pits. A plate of ham and beans with a whiskey at the Tivoli Hall Saloon cost almost nothing. The whiskey was terrible. Drinkers called it rotgut, red-eye, tarantula juice, and who hit John. But it made a man feel 10 feet tall, at least until morning. Most men were armed and usually drunk, and very few honest lawmen were around to intervene. Murders were common. Arrests were rare. The city's leaders were not blind to this. In 1876, they elected Timothy Isaiah Courtright as city marshal with a specific mandate: tame the Acre. Courtright was a big man with long blonde hair and a gift for violence. He killed at least 5 men during his tenure and was suspected in several assassinations. On a busy Saturday night, he might collect and jail 30 people. But he allowed the gamblers to operate freely because gamblers attracted money. He understood the same arithmetic that every Fort Worth official understood. The Acre was a disgrace, but it was a profitable disgrace. The murder rate went down under Courtright. The revenue did not. The Acre's most famous establishment stood just outside its official boundaries, the White Elephant Saloon, where Fort Worth's gambling king, Luke Short, presided over the high-stakes card rooms. Short was a former Dodge City gunfighter, 5'7" in his boots, soft-spoken, and extremely fast with a pistol. The city's former marshal, Timothy Isaiah Courtright, known as Long-Hair Jim, was running a protection racket out of a front he called the TIC Commercial Detective Agency. He visited the saloons and gambling dens and politely suggested they pay for his services. Most did. Luke Short told him to go to hell. On the overcast evening of February 8, 1887, at about 8 o'clock, Courtright showed up at the White Elephant with 2 Colt .45s visible in his pockets and called for Short to come outside. Short came down from the card rooms. He was, as always, impeccably dressed. Flowered vest, hat, 6-gun concealed in his pocket. A mutual friend, Jake Johnson, tried to calm things. The 3 men walked up the sidewalk, arguing about Courtright's demands, until they stopped in front of Ella Blackwell's shooting gallery. Courtright accused Short of being armed. Short denied it, though he was lying. Then Courtright said loudly, "Don't you pull a gun on me." Short lifted his vest to show he had no weapon visible. It was theater. Both men knew what was coming. Courtright reached for his Colt. Both men drew. Short fired first. His bullet took off Courtright's thumb. Courtright tried the border shift, switching his gun to his uninjured hand, but he was too slow. Short fired 4 more times. Courtright fell dead in the street, 3 shots in his body. Bat Masterson, who was with Short that night, later wrote that no time was wasted in the exchange of words once the men faced each other. Courtright's funeral drew hundreds. Short was arrested but never tried. He became, by acclamation, the king of Fort Worth gamblers. He was dead himself 6 years later of dropsy at 39. The thing about the Courtright shooting, and this is what makes Fort Worth's story different from Tombstone or Dodge City, is that the city's reaction was not to shut the Acre down, but to manage it. Hell's half-acre accounted for roughly half the city's crime, but it also accounted for a staggering share of the city's economy. The saloons and gambling halls paid licensing fees. The fines levied on prostitutes and barkeepers were a reliable revenue stream. The visitors who came for vice also bought supplies, stayed in hotels, ate in restaurants, and hired horses. Fort Worth civic leaders understood this arithmetic perfectly. They tolerated the illegal activities, the Fort Worth Democrat reported, because of their importance to the town's economy. The city's relationship with its own underworld was not a failure of governance. It was a business decision. By 1890, the population had reached 23,076, and Fort Worth was the 5th largest city in Texas. A reform campaign after the Courtright shooting and the grisly murder of a prostitute known only as Sally, found nailed to an outhouse door in the Acre, shut down some of the worst violence. But the essential structure held. The saloons stayed, the gambling halls stayed, the bordellos stayed. The money kept flowing. And as the century turned, a second wave of investment was about to dwarf everything that had come before. In 1893, a Boston capitalist named Greenleaf Simpson arrived in Fort Worth to inspect the Union Stockyards, which had been built north of the Trinity River in 1889. Simpson found the pens full of cattle and decided the city represented a good livestock market. What he didn't know, and what nobody told him, was that the pens were only full because recent heavy rains and a railroad strike had temporarily stranded the animals. It was essentially a lucky accident. Simpson bought the stockyards for $133,333.33 and renamed them the Fort Worth Stockyards Company. He brought in a Boston neighbor, Louisville V. Niles, whose expertise was meatpacking. Together, they had an idea that seems obvious in retrospect, but was, at the time, audacious. Instead of shipping live cattle to distant cities for processing, build the packing plants right here. By 1900, they had persuaded 2 of the nation's largest meat packers, Armour and Company and Swift and Company, to construct plants adjacent to the stockyards. Fort Worth city leaders, having wooed the companies for months, sweetened the deal with a $50,000 bonus paid to each company for choosing Fort Worth, plus donated land and a 1/3 interest in the Stockyards Company for each packer. The remaining third stayed with Simpson, Niles, and other investors. Even the choice of building sites was settled with a coin toss. Armour won and chose the northern tract. Swift took the southern one, which turned out to contain a gravel pit they used for construction, and even sold some of the gravel back to Armour. 2,500 construction workers swarmed over 30 combined acres, building slaughterhouses, pens, railroad tracks, vats, water towers, and passageways. The two plants opened simultaneously on March 6, 1903. It was the biggest economic development Fort Worth had seen since the railroad arrived a quarter century earlier. At its height, Armour alone was contributing an estimated $50 million a year to the local economy. The Livestock Exchange Building, a two-story Spanish-style structure built for $125,000, became the nerve center of the entire operation. Commission companies, telegraph offices, railroad offices, and was soon called the Wall Street of the West. The effect on Fort Worth was seismic. In the decade after Armour and Swift arrived, the city's population tripled. By 1910, it had reached 73,312. Immigrants from Central Europe flooded in to work the plants, settling in a community north of the river called North Fort Worth, which had exploded from 200 residents in 1902 to 10,000 by 1907. The packing plants provided more than wages. There were company picnics, baseball games, even a YMCA program. Swift sponsored a variety show on radio station KGKO. Both companies provided medical care, emergency leave, and pension plans. The workers were loyal enough that when union strikes hit the meatpacking industry in 1949 and 1952, Swift's Fort Worth employees chose not to participate. Fort Worth annexed North Fort Worth in 1909, but deliberately left the actual stockyards and packing plants outside the city limits to create a tax-free industrial zone. When Fort Worth moved to annex that zone too, the stockyard interests responded by incorporating their own tiny municipality in 1911, Niles City, named for Louisville Niles. It covered half a square mile and had 508 residents. But within its borders sat the stockyards, the packing plants, and the Livestock Exchange Building, properties valued at over $12 million. Niles City called itself the richest little city in the world. 4,000 men and women worked for Swift and Armour. The Cowtown Coliseum, completed in just 88 working days in 1908 at a cost of $175,000, hosted the first indoor rodeo and the first cutting horse contest ever held indoors under electric lights. By 1906, Fort Worth's calf market ranked second only to Chicago's. The city had become the largest livestock market south of Kansas City. And still, down on the south end of Main Street, the Acre persisted. It had changed. Brick buildings had replaced the shotgun houses, and the population had shifted as African Americans, excluded from better neighborhoods, moved into the district alongside the vice establishments. By 1900, the Acre covered its maximum area, sprawling across 4 main thoroughfares. The Fort Worth 5 photograph was taken during this period. In 1906, a newspaper headline called the Acre Fort Worth's Den of Sin and Refuge of Criminals. In 1907, the Texas legislature outlawed gambling statewide, a direct blow to the Acre's financial model. Reform campaigns came and went, but the remaining businesses adapted and the neighborhood endured. The basic calculation, the Acre-generated revenue, was weakening, but it had not yet collapsed. Then, in October 1917, a superintendent named W.K. Gordon, working for the Texas Pacific Coal Company, struck oil 90 miles west of Fort Worth at a town called Ranger. Gordon had been ordered to stop drilling. Headquarters in New York cabled, "Believe had made mistake. Suggest you stop drilling." But he'd persuaded the company president to let him go a little deeper. The gusher transformed Ranger into a boomtown of 30,000 almost overnight. More oil was found at Desdemona, Breckenridge, and Burke Burnett. Fort Worth sat at the center of these fields like a spoke in a wheel. Before the oil boom, the city had 3 refineries. By the summer of 1920, 5 more had been built, with 4 more under construction. Oil-rich ranchers and farmers moved to Fort Worth and built luxurious homes and towering office buildings. Oil money poured into downtown and remade its skyline. In 1873, Kleber M. Van Zandt had established the first real bank in Fort Worth. Now, 50 years later, the banking district along Main Street was handling oil revenues that dwarfed anything the cattle trade had ever produced. The man who captured and directed that energy was Amon Giles Carter, born in a log cabin in Crafton, Texas in 1879, the son of a blacksmith. Carter had arrived in Fort Worth in 1905 with nothing but a rented typewriter, a 50-cent-a-month expense, and a $2,000 diamond ring that was easy to pawn. He talked his way into a job as advertising manager for a struggling new paper called the Fort Worth Star, then bought out the partners and acquired the rival Fort Worth Telegram in 1908 for $100,000, merging the two into the Fort Worth Star-Telegram on January 1st, 1909. Within 15 years, it had the largest circulation of any newspaper in the South. Carter was not a journalist. He was a force of civic will wearing a 10-gallon hat. He gave out silver dollars and 100-pound watermelons to visiting dignitaries. He built a radio station, WBAP, for $300. He launched the state's first television station in 1948. He became the largest single stockholder in American Airlines and moved its headquarters from Dallas to Fort Worth. He drilled 99 dry holes before striking a rich oil field and selling part of it for $16.5 million to fund the Amon Carter Foundation. National Geographic would say in 1961 that he had done more than any other one person to build the city. Time magazine profiled him. He counted Will Rogers and Walter Winchell among his friends. Fully a fourth of Fort Worth's population, Time reported, worked in factories, businesses, and offices that had moved to the city because of Carter's personal salesmanship. Carter's slogan for Fort Worth, "Where the West begins," still appears daily on the Star-Telegram's front page. He deployed it ruthlessly against Dallas, 30 miles to the east. Dallas, Carter liked to say, is where the East peters out. He refused to buy anything in Dallas, including food. On his rare visits, he carried a box lunch rather than spend a dime in enemy territory. His television station, WBAP-TV, avoided mentioning Dallas on his express orders, even when it was obvious the two cities constituted a single market. The rivalry was personal, petty, and relentless, and it worked. It gave Fort Worth an identity separate from its larger neighbor, a story to tell about itself that was not just geography, but philosophy. Dallas was banking and insurance and Eastern respectability. Fort Worth was cattle and oil and Western grit. Whether or not this was entirely true did not matter. Carter made people believe it. When Dallas won the bidding war to host the state's official 1936 Texas Centennial Exposition, a prize that logically should have gone to San Antonio, where the actual history of 1836 had happened, Carter countered by staging Fort Worth's own rival, Frontier Centennial, hiring Broadway impresario Billy Rose, bringing in an elephant named Jumbo, and the scandalous fan dancer Sally Rand, and erecting huge neon signs advertising Wild and Whoopee. He built the original Casa Mañana Theater. The Fort Worth show, by most accounts, was considerably more fun. Oil money built the buildings that still define downtown Fort Worth. The Burke-Burnett Building, the city's first true skyscraper, had already risen at 500 Main Street in 1914. 12 stories of neoclassical terracotta and red brick, designed by Sanguinet and Stotts for the State National Bank, which went bankrupt a year later. Cattleman Samuel Burke-Burnett bought it and renamed it. Then came the oil-era towers. The Sinclair Building at 512 Main, designed by Wiley G. Clarkson for oilman Richard O. Dulaney, opened in 1930. 16 stories of zigzag modern Art Deco, its limestone panels carved with zigzag friezes, its spandrels in dark green cast stone, eagles perched at the 14th floor. Before construction was even finished, Sinclair Oil leased 7 floors. The billion-dollar Sinclair Prairie Oil Company moved its headquarters there in 1932. The Blackstone Hotel, designed by Moran, Russell, and Crowell of St. Louis, opened in 1929. The Texas and Pacific Railway Terminal, designed by Wyatt C. Hedrick, opened in 1931 at the southern edge of downtown. An Art Deco masterpiece with dramatic setbacks, terrazzo floors, plaster ceilings, and stylized fixtures, standing at the exact spot where the railroad had arrived 55 years earlier and saved the city from the panther. All of these buildings were on or near Main Street. If you stood at the Tarrant County Courthouse on the bluff and looked south, you could see the new skyline rising, the Burnett, the Sinclair, the Blackstone, marching down Main Street toward the old Acre, toward the depot where the first locomotive had arrived. Fort Worth had transformed itself from a frontier cattle town into an oil boom metropolis in barely a generation, and it had done it on the same half-mile of road. But the transformation was not only upward, it was also a burial. The city that had tolerated Hell's Half-Acre for 50 years because vice was good business had found better business. The Acre had been declining since the turn of the century. The progressive movement pressured city officials. The arrival of Camp Bowie on the outskirts of Fort Worth during World War I brought the final blow. The Army imposed martial law on the district, fining and jailing prostitutes and barkeepers to keep its recruits out of trouble. In 1919, a Fort Worth pastor named J. Frank Norris held a mock funeral parade to bury John Barleycorn. Prohibition finished the job. By 1920, the Acre, as a functioning vice district, was dead. But the neighborhood endured in diminished form: pawn shops, betting parlors, strip joints, cheap rooming houses. The area's reputation, combined with its history as a black business district where rents stayed low because of deliberate neglect, kept it depressed for decades. The establishments Fort Worth had tried to remove kept reappearing in one form or another. It remained the seedy lower end of downtown, a persistent embarrassment to the city's boosters right through mid-century. Meanwhile, the stockyards were approaching their own peak. During World War I, Fort Worth became the largest horse and mule market in the country, as agents of foreign governments purchased cavalry animals at the yards. The year 1917 set records that would stand for nearly 30 years. More than 1 million cattle and 1 million hogs arrived, a total of 3.5 million animals. Niles City, the richest little city in the world, was finally absorbed into Fort Worth in 1923, despite litigation to block the annexation. The stockyards processed 5,277,496 head of livestock during World War II alone, making 1944 the peak year of the entire operation. And then it was over. The decline came from the same place the boom had: transportation. After World War II, newly paved roads gave rise to trucking, which was cheaper and more flexible than railroads. Ranchers could now sell their cattle closer to home. Smaller local livestock auctions and feedlots drew business away from centralized markets. The packing plants were served by railroads. Livestock was now being moved by truck. Both Armour and Swift had massive aging facilities that now faced rising costs, wages, and administrative expenses. Workers accepted pay cuts to keep the plants running. It was not enough. Armour closed its Fort Worth plant in 1962. After 6 decades of operation, the plant that had once poured $50 million a year into the local economy simply shut its doors. Its office building was demolished. Swift hung on for 9 more years, laying off workers, reducing output. The remaining employees took voluntary pay cuts to help keep the plant running. The same workers who had refused to join union strikes a decade earlier because Swift had treated them well. It was not enough. Swift closed in 1971. Its 1,700 employees walked out for the last time. Then the empty buildings caught fire, first in 1971, then again in 1973, when 70 years' worth of animal fat soaked into the walls and floors turned the blaze into an inferno that burned for 3 weeks. A wrecking company was hired to demolish what remained, but after breaking 3 wrecking balls on the massive brick structures, Hearn Wrecking and Lumber admitted defeat. The ruins stood, weedy and windswept, an urban ghost town inside a living city. The neighborhoods that had housed multiple generations of packing plant workers faced deterioration and abandonment as the jobs disappeared. By 1986, stockyard sales had fallen to an all-time low of 57,181 animals. A couple named Charlie and Sue McCafferty founded the North Fort Worth Historical Society in 1976, the year Niles City's former city hall was demolished to make way for a parking lot, and fought to get the stockyards declared a National Historic District. Federal grants financed some renovation in the 1980s, and the stockyards gradually reinvented themselves as a tourist destination. But the industrial economy that had tripled the city's population was gone. The other burial happened at the south end of Main Street. In the late 1960s, the city launched an urban renewal project that demolished the remaining structures in the old Hell's Half Acre to build the Fort Worth Convention Center. A consortium of 5 local architects designed the facility, which opened in 1968, where the saloons and cribs had stood for a century. The buildings that were razed, the last remnants of the acre, a mix of shotgun houses, brick rooming houses, and small commercial buildings, were in many cases similar in age and style to the Victorian structures that would later be lovingly restored in Sundance Square a few blocks north. But in the acre, they were not restored. They were erased. Then, in 1974, the Amon G. Carter Foundation funded the construction of the Fort Worth Water Gardens on the adjacent site. Philip Johnson and John Burgee designed an urban park of cascading concrete and water. 3 main pools, including an active pool, where thousands of gallons of water cascade down a 38-foot series of steps into a vortex. The park was built on the ground where, 90 years earlier, a prostitute named Sally had been found nailed to an outhouse door. One historian noted that there was definitely a conscious effort to erase some of that history, to use water, literally, to wash the acre away. The area north of the convention center became Sundance Square, named for the Sundance Kid, a cheerful acknowledgment of the very outlaws the city had once harbored. The district was developed by the Bass family, descendants of oil wealth, who invested hundreds of millions of dollars in restoring Victorian-era commercial buildings that had survived in the blocks between 3rd and 7th Streets. The Sinclair, which by the late 1980s had fallen into disrepair, was purchased and restored in 1990. Its zigzag friezes and Mayan accents returned to their original appearance. In 2019, it reopened as a Marriott Autograph Collection hotel. The Flatiron Building, one of Fort Worth's earliest high-rises, inspired by its Manhattan namesake, still wears its panther head gargoyles at the 2nd floor. Today, if you walk south down Main Street from the courthouse, you pass through Sundance Square, the brick sidewalks, the restaurants, the Bass Performance Hall with its 48-foot limestone angels. And you are walking directly over the ground where Hell's Half Acre once sprawled across 15 city blocks. The 600 block of Main Street, now a pleasant spot for a lunch date, sits near the address where the Fort Worth Five had their photograph taken at Swartz's studio. The convention center stands where the Tivoli Hall Saloon once served rot gut whiskey and ham and bean plates. The Water Gardens cascade where the dance halls used to be. The White Elephant Saloon, where Luke Short killed long-haired Jim Courtright on that overcast February evening in 1887, no longer stands at its original location. The building burned around 1900. But in 1970, a new White Elephant Saloon opened in the Stockyards a few miles north. and the owners installed a plaque commemorating the gunfight. Every year on February 8th, actors reenact the shooting in the street out front. The actual site, downtown, near where the water gardens are today, is unmarked. Courtwright and Short are both buried at Oakwood Cemetery in Fort Worth, a short walk apart. Courtwright was about 42 when Short killed him. Short was 33. He had 6 years left to live, and he spent most of them gambling. Amon Carter died of a heart attack on June 23, 1955, at 75. In his final years, he had stopped barnstorming on behalf of Fort Worth, but the city he had built by sheer force of salesmanship was already running on its own momentum. He had brought Consolidated Aircraft to Fort Worth in 1941, creating thousands of defense jobs. During World War II, B-24 bombers rolled off the assembly line at the Convair plant. He had turned Fort Worth into an aviation center. His namesake airport, Amon Carter Field, served the city until Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport replaced it in 1974. On November 21, 1963, President John F. Kennedy spent his last night alive in the Hotel Texas in downtown Fort Worth, just blocks from where the Acre had once been. Kennedy gave his final public speech the next morning to a crowd gathered in front of the hotel. Then the motorcade left for Dallas. The Star Telegram television station, WBAP-TV, continued to avoid mentioning Dallas on Carter's standing orders, even when it was obvious the two cities constituted a single market. NBC eventually pressured Carter's heirs to relent several years after his death. The transmitter was moved to Cedar Hill to cover both cities equally. The Fort Worth Stockyards now host a twice-daily reenactment cattle drive for tourists. Longhorns are herded down Exchange Avenue by real cowhands. Billy Bob's Texas bills itself as the world's largest honky-tonk. The Livestock Exchange Building houses a museum. The Swift headquarters, the plantation-style office building that survived the fires, was renovated as a spaghetti warehouse restaurant in the 1970s and later became corporate offices for XTO Energy. Behind it, 22 acres of crumbling plant buildings, overgrown brick streets, and rusting railroad tracks sat for decades, cacti growing on the roofs, graffiti on the walls, until a California development company purchased the rights to redevelop the site in 2015. Many of the time-worn landmarks were demolished. Fort Worth's population today approaches 1 million people. It is the 12th largest city in America. It is a center for finance, healthcare, education, and technology, industries that have nothing to do with cattle, oil, or the soldiers who once stumbled out of the Acre at dawn. The transformation is, by any measure, a success story. The city survived a sleeping panther, a near death in the 1870s, the violent excesses of its own vice district, the rise and fall of the meatpacking industry, and the oil bust of the 1980s. It adapted. It grew. And yet, the buildings that Fort Worth chose to save and the buildings it chose to destroy tell their own story. The Art Deco towers, the Sinclair, the T&P Terminal, the Blackstone, were preserved and restored. The Sundance Square Victorians were saved. The Stockyards were declared a historic district. But the Acre, the original economic engine, the thing that kept the city alive when there was nothing else, the district that tolerated Butch Cassidy and financed the city's first schools and paved its first streets, was bulldozed and covered with a convention center and a cascading pool of water designed by a New York architect. The neighborhood where the city's black residents had built businesses and raised families for decades was razed along with it. The messy, violent, profitable truth was replaced with concrete and falling water and a sense of civic progress. The name Sundance Square is all that remains, a wink at the very outlaws the city once harbored and then chose to forget. On the courthouse lawn, there is a bronze statue of a sleeping panther. It lies on its side, eyes closed, perfectly still. The plaque says the statue commemorates the 1875 insult that became a badge of pride. The Panther looks south, down Main Street, toward the spot where John Swartz's studio used to be, toward the ground where the water gardens now fall. It is still sleeping.